This is the story of the worst alleged case of Munchausen syndrome I've ever heard. This happened very recently, and it's a really good example of the new phenomenon a journalist coined Munchausen by internet, where people use social media to share exaggerated or fake medical conditions. It is a real-life horror story that people on social media watched play out. I do want to warn you that the story can be incredibly graphic and it does contain some triggering themes. That being said, this is the story of Kelly Ronahan. This is Kelly Ronahan. She is Canadian, she has a twin, and she's actually a former ballet dancer and teacher. A woman after my own heart. Kelly reports to having some pretty traumatic teen years. Allegedly, she had a boyfriend who subjected her to all sorts of traumatic situations. None of the claims were ever substantiated. However, she claims that they had a profound and long-lasting effect on her. She had had a documented history of mental illness. She suffered from anorexia as well, and started to experience a mysterious form of anemia. She was always in and out of hospitals receiving blood transfusions because her blood volume was always low. Like, her blood was just disappearing. She even went on the news in 2016 to advocate for people to donate blood because her life depended on it. She claimed that within 2 years, she had received over 70 transfusions, amounting like 25 gallons or 95 liters of blood. She was very open and active on social media and would often show pictures of her in the hospital, showing that she was in good spirits and had a positive attitude about her situation. Here's the thing. Apparently, losing blood isn't a thing unless you are actively bleeding or you're bloodletting. And doctors and those close to Kelly were starting to suspect that she was drawing the blood herself. Until 2018, when some mysterious blisters started appearing on her legs, which we will talk about in part 2. This is the story of the worst case of Munchausen syndrome I've ever heard, part 2. This is the story of Kelly Ronahan. To pick up where we left off, Kelly was experiencing a mysterious form of anemia, and those closest to her were starting to suspect that she was drawing her own blood in order to receive medical care she didn't need. And in 2018, her health seemed to take a turn for the worse when she started experiencing mysterious blisters all over her legs. It started out fairly mild. It looked like eczema, like it was, just a bunch of sores that would scab over on her legs. I've had eczema and it looked pretty similar to this. But the blisters got worse in pretty much every way you can conceive of. There were more blisters, they were deeper, they were bigger. And she was in and out of hospitals again because she had constant wound infections. Kelly received a diagnosis of Behçet's disease, which is an autoimmune disorder that can cause skin sores. However, Behçet's typically presents all over the body, whereas Kelly's case was localized to her legs, specifically her lower legs. So people started to suspect that Kelly was doing this to herself. Once again, Kelly does admit to being a picker and would share on social media that she would have to pick off scabs constantly, would even use scissors to cut off some of the sores. This obviously didn't do her any favors. She was constantly picking off scabs, even using scissors sometimes to cut away at the sores. And it would interfere with healing until her legs started to resemble a huge black scab. I'll totally get reported if I share a picture of it, but I mean, it's like a burnt pizza. I do want to add that if you're interested in learning more, there is a photo journal online documenting her experiencing with her legs, but I do want to warn you, it is incredibly graphic and haunting. This is her leg bandaged up. You can see her feet are incredibly swollen, her leg's a different shape, and she actually receives medical intervention, which we will talk about in part 3. This is the worst case of Munchausen syndrome I've ever heard. Part 3. I do want to warn you that this part of the story gets pretty disturbing and gory and includes some pretty triggering subject matter. This is the story of Kelly Ronahan. To pick up where we left off, this is Kelly. She has recently been given a diagnosis of Behçet's disease, which is an autoimmune disorder that causes kind of sores all over the body. However, her friends, family, and her doctors are starting to suspect that all of her injuries are self-inflicted. And within a matter of months, Kelly has picked her legs to the point where they're unrecognizable and wounded and maimed beyond recognition and needed some pretty serious medical intervention. The entire front of her shins were completely black and scabbed over. She even posted a story on Instagram of her tapping the sores with a pen, and it was just hard as a rock. The tissue obviously needed to be removed, so she was admitted to the hospital, and she had surgery to have a debridement on her lower legs and actually received a skin graft from her thigh. And she did document the whole thing, her entire stay in the hospital. And it actually worked. The skin grafts took. Her legs were healing. Her sores were healing. And she was released from the hospital with a positive prognosis of being able to live a full, healthy life with the use of her legs. The end. I'm so sorry, that's not the end, and unfortunately it gets so much worse from here. A couple of weeks after she was discharged, she posted a picture on Instagram of sores starting to pop up over her brand new skin grafts. Things progressed pretty quickly after this. She's pretty much in and out of hospitals because her legs have gotten exponentially worse. Worse than they were before, to be honest. There were even reports that her wounds tested positive for fecal matter. Whether or not that was deliberate, we'll really never know, because that can happen if you don't wash your hands properly. But the pictures she is sharing on social media are ghastly. I mean, the skin grafts are completely ruined. But it's to the point where her muscles are exposed. You can actually see the tibia in her right leg. There's so many disturbing photos of her legs, but the peak gore for me was one she shared, where she actually reported something popping out like a guitar string, and she's pretty sure it was a nerve. I mean, her legs were dead. I don't know if you know what crocodile victims look like, but that's similar to what it looked like. And I'll wrap it up in part 4. This is the worst case of Munchausen syndrome I've ever heard. Part 4. I do want to warn you that this story contains some disturbing information and some triggering subject matter. This is the story of Kelly Ronahan. Picking up where we left off in part 3, Kelly is claiming to experience something called Behçet's disease, but the medical community and her friends and family are pretty sure she's suffering from dermatillomania and is picking at her legs. She received a skin graft, it was healing beautifully, and unfortunately she picked right through it. Her legs were completely deformed. Her muscles were exposed, her right tibia was exposed, her wound tested positive for fecal matter. We don't know if that's deliberate or not. And the scabs are blackened over, and it got to the point where she was picking, and she actually picked out a nerve. And she's sharing all of this on Instagram and Facebook, and people are basically watching in horror as she deteriorates. And her posts are so graphic that she constantly gets reported, and both of her accounts were shut down ultimately. There was a post found on a medical advice forum, and while it doesn't expressly state Kelly's name, all of the facts are basically identical to her case. And they're basically discussing what the best course of action is. Her legs are completely rotted through. There's actually a post where you can see through her leg. And the doctors are pretty sure her legs are beyond saving, and amputation is the only way to go. But the doctors are nervous that, considering her psychiatric history, that she's going to pick through her stumps. Well, ultimately, that's the call the doctors made. On May 5th of 2021, this picture was shared on her Instagram, and it would be the last time that Kelly's photographed with her legs because she underwent a double amputation above the knee. The surgery went well. She spent months in the hospital working with a physical therapist. And the most recent information I can find is her life living as a Dumple amputee and working to get prosthetics. This is a photo of Kelly now, what I could find on her Instagram, and it seems like she is healing well. I did just want to revisit really quick that she did used to be a ballet dancer and teacher, and this was a picture of her before. Ultimately, Kelly's story is a tragic example of how serious mental illness is. And it stands to reason that her injuries could have been made a lot worse because of all of the attention and support she received by sharing that information. And that is probably the worst case of Munchausen syndrome I've ever heard.